In the summer of 1944, on a rain-soaked road in Normandy, steel screamed louder than men. A Panzer's cannon swept the hedgerows, hunting for American Shermans the way a scythe hunts wheat. Inside one battered tank, a young U.S. Army sergeant ran his hand over a rough, ugly slab of welded steel bolted to the hull, an armor patch the others laughed at, cursed, and called dumb. It wasn't in any manual. It didn't match the factory lines. It looked like desperation made solid. Hours earlier, men had mocked it. Minutes later, it would decide whether they lived to see another dawn. By nightfall, the laughing would stop, and so would a German round. He had never planned to be an innovator. He was a motor pool sergeant from a Midwestern town whose main skill was fixing what shouldn't still work. Before the invasion, he spent long nights in canvas-lit fields, soaked with oil and sweat, listening to engines cough themselves awake. The Sherman tank was fast and dependable, but everyone in Europe knew its weakness. Against German Panthers and Tigers, its armor felt thin as hope. Crews learned the sound of danger, the dry thunder of an 88, the tearing hiss of shrapnel, the metallic scream when steel failed and the inside of a tank became an oven. He had seen friends die not because they were slow or brave or careless, but because physics didn't care. The Germans had thicker armor and better guns. Facts like that settled into a man's chest and stayed there, heavy as lead. The idea came from wreckage. On a supply run, he passed a Sherman burned black, its side split open like a can. Nearby lay chunks of spare track links, heavy, curved, abandoned. He touched one, solid, thick, made to take punishment. That night, he lay awake to the distant rumble of artillery and thought about angles and distance, about how a round struck, how energy moved through metal. Manuals told him what should work. His eyes told him what had. In the morning, against regulations and reason, he asked for a welder. When he showed the others, they shook their heads. Welding spare track and scrap plate onto a tank's flank? That wasn't doctrine. It looked crude. It slowed the tank. It made mechanics curse. Officers worried about recognition. Would the enemy aim there? Would it unbalance the suspension? Some laughed because laughter was cheaper than fear. They called it a patch. They called it ugly. One man said it would melt off like wax. The sergeant swallowed it all. He felt the heat on his neck as the sparks flew and steel fused to steel. He worked because the thought of doing nothing felt worse than ridicule. He doubted himself every second. He doubted while the weld cooled and the metal skin hissed under rain. He doubted when the tank rolled out, heavier and louder, its silhouette altered by an idea that didn't belong. He doubted because the war punished mistakes mercilessly. And yet, beneath the doubt, there was a stubborn certainty born not from genius, but from watching too many men burn. If the patch gave them even a breath more time, one heartbeat, one shouted order, it would be worth every sideways look. By afternoon, word spread. By evening, they rolled toward the hedgerows, and somewhere ahead, a Panzer crew loaded around and waited. The road narrowed as the hedgerows closed in, green walls dripping with rain and secrecy. The tank's engine vibrated through boots and bones, a steady growl that never quite drowned out the war around them. Inside, air tasted of oil and cordite. Sweat ran down spines despite the cold. No one joked now. Each man listened for the sound that decided everything. The cough of a gun, the crack of a hit, the shriek of metal proving weaker than intent. The sergeant kept his eyes forward but felt the patch behind him like a second heartbeat, dead weight and promise welded to the hull. They saw the Panzer second. It announced itself with thunder. An 88 cracked, the sound flattening the air, and the world lurched as the round came in fast and straight. Training said to move. Instinct froze. The impact slammed into the tank's side with a noise like the sky breaking. A hard, metallic punch that drove breath from lungs. The hull rang. Tools jumped from hooks. For a fraction of a second, no one knew if they were alive. Smoke bloomed inside, gray and sour. A man screamed, then stopped. The driver shouted. The gunner blinked away sparks dancing in his vision. And then there was no fire. No flash of orange rage spilling through a torn seam. The tank had not opened like a wound. The steel held, shuddering but unbroken. The patch bore the mark, a cratered bite, metal bruised and folded, track links deformed but still fused in place. The round had spent itself there, bleeding energy into scrap and angle, robbed of the clean path it needed to kill. Time snapped back into place. Commands followed. The Sherman lurched forward, turned, fired. Somewhere outside, another explosion answered. Inside the tank, men touched the walls like they were checking their own bodies. Hands shook. Breaths came back in pieces. The sergeant felt the heat radiating from the patch, a dull warmth seeping through the floor plates. His doubt collided with reality and cracked. It hadn't made them invincible. It hadn't made them safe. But it had kept the thin line intact long enough for life to continue, long enough to fight back. Afterward, in the quiet that followed, never true silence, just the war holding its breath, someone laughed once, sharp and unbelieving. The word dumb wasn't spoken again. The mark on the steel looked almost deliberate now, like evidence. Orders traveled faster than bullets. A lieutenant crouched and stared at the crater, then at the welds, then at the sergeant. He didn't smile. He nodded. By nightfall, in fields lit by shaded lanterns, other crews asked for welders. Scrap disappeared. Ugly patches multiplied, each one a small rebellion against the math of death. The sergeant lay awake again that night, the echo of impact replaying behind his eyes. He understood something then, not as pride, but as weight. An idea could not choose its consequences. It could only be tested. Tomorrow would test it again. Harder. Somewhere ahead, another Panzer would load another round. The patch would have to earn its place in steel all over again. Victory never felt clean. As the days pressed on, the patched Shermans pushed deeper into fields that reeked of wet earth and burned fuel. The patches worked, sometimes. Other times they failed just enough to remind everyone that nothing in war was magic. A hit at the wrong angle still killed. A round striking elsewhere still tore men apart. And each time a tank burned, the sergeant felt his chest tighten with a quiet, poisonous question. Did I make them believe too much? Innovation carried a shadow. When men trusted steel, they stood longer. When they stood longer, the price could be everything. Mechanics complained about the extra weight. Drivers cursed the slower turns and strained suspensions. Officers worried the tanks were becoming rolling scrap piles. German gunners learned to adapt, aiming low, aiming high, searching for the weak places that always existed. Rumors moved faster than truth. Stories of lucky ricochets grew into legends by night, and by morning, legends threatened to replace caution. The sergeant tried to correct them. He spoke softly, without authority beyond oil-stained hands and sleepless eyes. He said the patch bought seconds, not miracles. He said nothing could stop an 88 forever. He said, keep moving, keep low, keep fear close enough to listen to. Inside him, another fear took root. If his idea spread and failed, names would be remembered. If it saved lives, it would blend into the noise of war and vanish. He was not chasing glory. He was dodging regret. Every time a welder sparked to life under canvas, he felt again the night he decided to act. He thought about home, about men who would never return, and about the thin, unfair difference between them and those who would. That difference, he knew now, was often no bigger than a welded plate and the will to defy instructions written far from the sound of guns. Then came the village marked only by rubble. The column slowed. Smoke hung like a low ceiling. A Panther waited at the far end of the street, its long gun calm, confident. The first shot missed wide, shattering stone. The second struck a patched Sherman square, tearing into the added steel. The impact lifted the tank's side and dropped it again with a roar. Inside, bones rattled. Outside, the patch folded inward, cracked and held just long enough for the driver to punch the throttle and break the line of fire. Another tank answered. The Panther burned. When the shooting ended, the sergeant saw the damage up close. The patch was ruined, bent, and split, its welds scarred white. It had done exactly what he prayed it would do, and no more. He rested his hand on cooling metal and felt the tremor leave him. Around him, men spoke his name, not loudly, not formally, but with the quiet certainty reserved for those who earned trust without asking. He didn't correct them. He couldn't. War didn't leave room for humility ceremonies. It demanded results, and then it demanded more. That night he wrote nothing down. There would be no manual, no patent, no applause. Only a lesson passing hand to hand in the dark. Pay attention, question limits, act before permission catches up to necessity. Tomorrow the road would narrow again. Tomorrow steel would scream. And between the two, ordinary men would keep choosing to build something imperfect and carry it forward anyway. By the time the weather broke, the patched tanks were no longer curiosities. They were part of the landscape, uneven silhouettes moving through fog, steel stitched to steel like field bandages on a wounded giant. No orders ever made it official. There was no stamped approval, no neat diagram sent down from headquarters. It spread the only way truth spreads in war, survivor to survivor. Crews took what they could find, track links, spare plates, anything thick and stubborn, and turned fear into weight. The sergeant moved from unit to unit, hands black with soot, guiding welds, warning about angles, reminding men that mass and slope mattered more than hope. He slept in pieces, measured in minutes between shellings. Then came the counterattack everyone dreaded. The Germans pushed hard along a ridge boxed by fields, armor rolling like iron tide. The first exchange sounded like the tearing of the world. Shermans maneuvered, engines screaming, turrets snapping. A Panther's round slammed into a patched flank and bit deep. The added steel tore, diverting the shot, choking it on layers it hadn't expected. The tank lurched and lived. Another round struck another patch. This one failed, but it failed crooked, shedding energy, turning a killing blow into a wound. Men escaped through hatches, scorched and shaking, but breathing. The line bent, then held. Afterward, officers walked the ground with different eyes. They traced impacts, measured angles, argued quietly. Reports went up. The language was careful. Campo expedients, situational survivability. No one promised miracles. No one laughed anymore. The sergeant was called in once, briefly. He stood straight, helmet under his arm, heart beating too loud. He expected reprimand for breaking rules that kept order from dissolving. Instead, there was a question. How fast could it be done? How heavy before it broke suspensions? Where best to place the steel? It wasn't praise. It was acceptance, the kind forged by necessity. That night he allowed himself to think about tomorrow, about tanks rolling with a little more confidence, crews buying a little more time. He also thought about the cost. Innovation was a gamble taken with other men's hearts. He felt the weight of it settle into his shoulders, heavier than any plate he'd welded on. He resolved again to speak honestly, to never sell hope as armor. When the tanks moved at dawn, fog lifting, engines warming, the patches looked less like defiance and more like care. Rough, improvised care, done by hands that refused to surrender to the cold logic of loss. The war rolled on. Names blurred, days folded into each other. But in those fields, where steel met steel and ideas met reality, something quiet had changed. The line held not because men were braver, but because someone had dared to notice, to touch the wreckage, and to ask a better question than the one printed in the book. When the war finally loosened its grip, it did not end cleanly. It faded, leaving behind yards of twisted armor and men who jumped at the slam of doors. The patched tanks went back to depots, their ugly additions cut away or scrapped without ceremony. No plaque remembered the welds that bought seconds. No dispatch praised the idea that refused to wait its turn. The sergeant went home thinner, quieter, carrying the smell of hot metal in his memory. He returned to ordinary problems: engines that wouldn't start, winters that arrived on schedule, nights that were too still, but the sound of impact never truly left him. In histories, the change would be summarized blandly. Crews added track links and spare armor to increase survivability. A line in a footnote, a photograph without a name. What would not fit on the page was the feeling of the first hit, the suspended breath, the exact instant when fear met resistance and did not win. What would not be captured was the courage it took to be laughed at in daylight for an idea you believed in at night. The innovation wasn't the steel. It was the choice, made by someone without rank enough to demand belief, that action was better than permission when lives were waiting. Years later, when people asked why soldiers did such things, the answer was never about cleverness. It was about care. Care sharp enough to question orders written far from the sound of guns. Care steady enough to accept that saving one crew did not save them all. Care humble enough to know that improvisation did not make heroes, only survivors. The patch stopped a Panzer round once, then again, then failed when it had to. In those outcomes lived the truth of war and invention alike. Nothing works forever, but something can work now. And that is what remains. Not the mockery, not the cratered steel, but the reminder that history is often nudged, not by grand plans or perfect machines, but by ordinary people willing to carry doubt, endure scorn, and still put their hands to the work. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it sounds like a welder striking an arc in the dark, and holding it steady because a few seconds, bought honestly, can mean the difference between a name remembered by family and a place marked by smoke. History often teaches us to look for brilliance in blueprints and authority in rank. But the war left behind a different lesson, one harder to frame and easier to forget. It showed that progress does not always arrive with permission, and survival does not always wait for approval. Sometimes it comes from a man standing in the rain, staring at wreckage, willing to admit that the book is not enough. Sometimes it comes from hands that shake, not from fear of failure, but from the weight of knowing others will live or die by what you choose to do next. The patched armor never changed the outcome of the war by itself. It did something far quieter and far more human. It reminded men inside burning machines that they were not helpless, that they could still shape their chances with thought, effort, and care. It proved that courage is not only found in charging forward under fire, but in standing alone beforehand while laughter and doubt test your resolve. Innovation, at its most honest, is not about genius. It is about responsibility, the refusal to accept loss as inevitable when action is still possible. Every generation faces its own version of thin armor and heavy guns. The details change. The fear does not. And neither does the truth revealed on that muddy road in Normandy. Ordinary people, armed with nothing more than attention and conviction, can bend the future in small but vital ways. Not forever, not perfectly, but long enough to matter. Because sometimes the difference between tragedy and survival is not destiny or luck or orders from above. Sometimes it is a so-called dumb idea, held on to long enough to stop something terrible, just once. Long after the guns fell silent, the war kept teaching its lessons in smaller rooms. In workshops and classrooms, in maintenance bays and design labs, veterans spoke less about victories and more about margins, the inches, degrees, and seconds that decided outcomes. Some remembered a tank that survived a hit it shouldn't have. Others remembered the sound of a welding arc in the dark and the way it steadied the nerves. Those memories seeped into how a generation thought about protection, redundancy, and the truth that no system should rely on perfection. Armor would change, designs would evolve, but the principle endured. Listen to the field, respect the evidence, and let practical courage inform theory. The sergeant never claimed a legacy. He didn't need one. What endured was the idea that survival is often a collective craft, built from many small choices made under pressure. A patch of steel did not make men fearless. It made fear manageable. It gave crews a fragment of agency inside machines meant to erase individuality. And that fragment, earned with sweat and stubbornness, proved contagious. Others noticed. Others acted. Progress, like courage, moved laterally, from peer to peer, not vertically from command to order. In later years, when engineers spoke about spaced armor, sloping plates, and layered defenses, the language sounded clean and technical. But beneath it lived the memory of rain on canvas, sparks on wet ground, and a man deciding that ridicule was a smaller risk than regret. The war had taught him, and those who learned from him, that humanity advances not only through breakthroughs announced with banners, but through quiet refusals to accept unnecessary loss. Steel cools, paint peels, names fade. What doesn't fade is the responsibility each person carries when they notice a better way and choose whether to act. The patched armor was never meant to be beautiful or permanent. It was meant to buy time. And in buying time, it carved a place in history for the most uncelebrated kind of heroism. The kind that sees what is, imagines what could be, and does the work anyway. If you stand long enough among the machines left behind by war, you begin to understand that none of them were built to remember the people inside. Steel remembers force, not faces. Yet the patched armor carried something more than impact marks. It carried intent. It carried the moment someone chose to push against inevitability, knowing full well the choice might fail. That decision, quiet, unauthoritative, made without applause, is the measure by which real impact is often hidden, not in medals or headlines, but in the absence of loss that never becomes a statistic. The sergeant aged like most men who had seen too much too young. He learned to live with the knowledge that almost working ideas are sometimes the difference between life and death, and that waiting for certainty can be its own kind of surrender. When asked years later what courage looked like, he didn't describe heroics. He described responsibility. The responsibility to notice patterns others ignore. The responsibility to act before comfort returns. The responsibility to accept blame if it goes wrong and say nothing if it goes right. That, he believed, was the price of any improvement that mattered. Wars end, but the dilemma does not. In every field touched by risk, engineering, medicine, rescue, exploration, there comes a moment when doctrine lags behind reality. In that gap, people decide who they are. Some wait, some mock, some point out why it won't work, and some, carrying doubt as carefully as hope, step forward anyway. The patched armor is gone now, melted down into something else, its metal recycled into a world that barely remembers why it mattered. But its lesson still moves quietly through history, speaking to anyone standing at that edge. Because in the end, courage isn't proven by how loudly it announces itself. It's proven by what happens after the laughter fades, when a problem remains unsolved and the cost of doing nothing becomes heavier than the risk of trying. That is where ordinary people tip the scales, not by changing everything, but by changing enough. There is a moment in battle no film can capture. The silence that arrives when firing stops, but danger has not yet left. It hums in the ears. It presses against the lungs. In that narrow space, men count themselves alive. The patched armor mattered most there, in the pause between what almost happened and what didn't. Crews learned to listen again, to trust their senses without surrendering them. The steel gave them time to breathe, and in that breath lived clarity. Not bravery born of rage, but steadiness born of having survived the unthinkable by the smallest of margins. What the sergeant understood, even as it changed how tanks went into battle, was that fear never disappeared. It sharpened. It became a tool. The laughter that had met his idea was not cruelty. It was a defense. Mockery was easier than admitting that survival hinged on improvisation. When the laughter stopped, something harder replaced it. Accountability. Every added plate meant extra strain. Every choice had trade-offs. The men learned to weigh them honestly, to adjust, to remove what didn't help, and keep what did. Innovation became a conversation, not a proclamation. Years later, historians would look for a single origin, a named inventor, a tidy timeline. They would miss the truth that mattered most, that many hands shaped the solution and many voices corrected it. The first patch stopped around, but the second and third patch became better because others questioned it. Courage multiplied when it welcomed scrutiny. That is how practices endure, not by defending pride, but by inviting proof. In the end, the patched armor did not make the tanks unbeatable. It made the men inside them more aware of their choices. It taught them that survival is not passive, and neither is responsibility. The silence between shots returned again and again, and each time, the line of welded steel whispered the same reminder. Progress is fragile, shared, and earned anew with every decision to keep trying. The last lesson did not come under fire. It came later, quieter, when the war had moved on and the noise no longer crowded every thought. It arrived in reflections, in the way veterans paused before answering simple questions, in how they judged new ideas with patience instead of pride. The patched armor had taught them that survival is rarely about one bold act. It is about accumulation, small, imperfect decisions layered together like steel, each one absorbing part of the shock so the whole can endure. The sergeant carried that lesson without words. He knew now that history is shaped less by those who wait to be right than by those willing to be responsible. The patch was never about brilliance. It was about refusing to accept loss as normal when thought and effort could still intervene. It showed that courage can be awkward, unapproved, and easy to dismiss until the moment it matters most. And when that moment passes, courage often leaves no monument behind, only lives that continue. Steel corrodes, doctrines change, wars fade into chapters. But the truth forged on that road in Normandy remains simple and difficult. Progress is made by ordinary people who dare to act while knowing they might be wrong, who accept doubt as the cost of caring, and who keep working anyway. Sometimes that is enough to stop a Panzer round. Sometimes it is enough to change how the future survives.